This story comes from 404 Media. The title really says it all. So the FBI did have a warrant. That's a nice change of pace here. And they went to a Washington Post reporter's home and seized a bunch of devices. And specifically, they say that when they plugged in the iPhone to their forensics tool to try and extract information, they couldn't. There's some interesting stuff here that we talked about behind the scenes this week, and we were trying to figure out. They said there was a notification on the device's home screen that specifically said it's in lockdown mode. Those of us here at Privacy Guides that have iPhones, we were kind of playing around with it and like turning on lockdown mode and plugging it in and trying to like, can we recreate this? Because I've never heard of that. And as far as I know, none of us were able to recreate that. I think this may be like a something specific to that tool. Like maybe when you plug this thing into the forensics tool, it pops up and like, oh, lockdown mode is enabled or something. I guess just to kind of round out this story, there is kind of some bad news, which is that they were still able to get the information because they had the reporter access her MacBook, or they asked her for a Touch ID or a password, which for the record, I have it on good authority from a lawyer. You don't ever have to hand over your password. That is a violation of, I believe, the First and Fifth Amendment here in the US. But Touch ID they can do. They can make you like unlock the device or enter biometrics. You just never have to like specifically hand over your password. She said that she does not use biometrics, but investigators told her to try anyways. And they say when she applied her index finger to the fingerprint reader, the laptop unlocked. And then they were able to, it says they have not yet obtained a full image, but they did take photos and audio recordings of a conversation stored in Signal. Man, there's so many things to take away from this story. First of all, these stories are useful because iPhone is closed source, right? And I think it's really cool to get this kind of insight and confirmation that things like lockdown mode do work and they do provide that benefit that we're trusting them to provide. I know that in a perfect world, we would use something open source, but I don't know. The point I'm getting at is regardless, it's still good to know that these things work. And it's good to have this kind of third-party confirmation, even if it's kind of unfortunate that it has to come that way. And the other thing that really jumped out at me is, like I said at the end there, they were still able to access Signal because her device was unlocked. And I think that's a really important thing to talk about because a lot of the time we see this abused in the news or twisted in the news where they're like, oh my God, they accessed this person's Signal. And it's like, well, yeah, if the device is unlocked, of course they did. So all tools have limitations, right? There's no perfect tool out there. First of all, it's important that we know that. So if you send anything, I've said in the past on other recordings that anything you put in a digital format, you should be prepared for the possibility that it may end up in a data breach or something like that. So keep that in mind. But also it's important to enable things like disappearing messages and, to keep in mind that there's only so much we can do from the endpoint itself.
I think we should talk a little bit about why lockdown mode is kind of able to thwart these sort of police forensic tools. And one of the most important things that the lockdown mode actually does is it disables the device connections. So if you connect your iPhone or iPad to a computer, the device needs to be unlocked. So without lockdown mode enabled, sometimes it can actually automatically connect to a computer without explicit approval. That can allow mobile forensic tools like Graykey and Celebrite, which is like the common police forensic tools, to basically be able to extract information from the device. And we've seen this as well with Graphene OS. They have a similar setting in the settings where you can control the USB connection and change the options that are required if you connect the device to another computer, right? As you can see on the screen, Nate's brought this up here. It's the Apple support page about like the specifics of lockdown mode. Another thing that these forensic tools do is they often utilize vulnerabilities in software and hardware. And with lockdown mode enabled, it kind of protects you on both fronts, right? Because it stops the device connections, which can sometimes be exploited with vulnerabilities. And also it disables a lot of these quality of life features, but ones that are often used in exploits and vulnerabilities, such as like, complex web browsing tools are disabled. In this case, it says certain complex web technologies are blocked, which might cause some websites to load more slowly or operate correctly, as well as, it disables some of the Apple services as well. So I think this is quite an interesting story to see that lockdown mode actually did provide quite a benefit to someone, especially in like quite a vulnerable position. It's good to always see that this tool that Apple has put out is actually helping journalists in the field. Another thing that's kind of a bit of an unfortunate thing with this case that Nate kind of talked about was that they were kind of able to bypass the entire process because she had her MacBook with a Touch ID. I think it'd be really good if you could, Nate, if you could elaborate a little bit. You said there was laws around the First and Fifth Amendment. Could you maybe go into what exactly that means and why Touch ID can kind of bypass that?
The first mostly pertains to freedom of speech. The government is not allowed to infringe on your freedom of speech or your freedom of expression, your freedom to lobby the government for complaints, things like that. And then the Fifth Amendment is the one that protects against self-incrimination. So, for example, if any of you have ever watched a cop show that's set here in the US, which I'm sure is most of them, the Fifth Amendment is the one that, when people say, I plead the fifth, I'm not going to talk. Basically, the reason that this passwords and stuff like that fall under this is because, first of all, they can't force you to give up your password, because that's the one I'm not sure of, but I feel like I read this somewhere. That would fall under free speech. Like, they're kind of forcing you what to say. But it definitely falls under the Fifth Amendment, because you have a right, whether you're guilty or innocent, you have a right to not incriminate yourself. There's this protection against admitting and confessing if you don't want to. It falls under that because giving up your passwords could incriminate you, and therefore you are not required to do it. But like you said, there's workarounds. Real quick, let me say, I know for sure that you can be ordered to unlock a device, whether that's putting in the password and then handing it over, scanning your fingerprint, whatever. That is something the court can force you to do. Biometrics, I've heard conflicting reports, and a lot of these, we talked about this last year with the person who was charged for wiping their phone. Phones and biometrics and things are really in a gray area right now legally in the US, because some courts have ruled that, like, you need a warrant to search phones, and other courts have ruled no, you don't. And they're kind of at odds, and we're kind of waiting for the Supreme Court to weigh in and settle the matter once and for all. Biometrics kind of fall under that category of, even if you do need a warrant or whatever, it would still be something that they can force you to unlock the device, because it doesn't really fall under those same purviews of, like, against self-incrimination and stuff. It's a fun gray area right now in the US.
I think another important thing about this story that you kind of touched on a little bit when you were doing the initial coverage here was that when they were able to unlock the device, the MacBook in this case, there was actually a Signal application on the MacBook, and they were able to take evidence from that Signal application on that MacBook. And I think that's like a really important thing that we need to discuss, because people need to be careful about using Signal desktop applications because of this instance, right? Desktop computers have less security protections than a mobile device. And in this case, it's less of a security issue, more of just like an unfortunate circumstance where someone had biometrics enabled. But it does kind of show that, your security is only as secure as your weakest link, right? As soon as you have one link that breaks, your entire Signal history is going to be available to whoever's trying to attack the device.
I forget who it was, but somebody on Firewalls Don't Stop Dragons was talking about phones are almost like, from a security perspective, it's almost like we took all the lessons that we learned from computers and integrated them into smartphones. So smartphones are, for example, like, smartphones rarely have their updates mess up. They have significantly better security all around. They have better sandboxing and all kinds of stuff. I'm not really an expert on phones, but I know they're significantly more secure. That certainly is a good point, that the desktop devices are generally less secure, but also just being mindful of, backups, right? Like, backups are a good thing to have, especially in the privacy community. We're really big fans of not using the cloud, generally speaking. And it's like, okay, that's great. But what happens if, there's a house fire, or there's a flood, or anything? What happens if you get robbed? Especially, like, I used to have a little external portable hard drive that was my backup drive. And the first thing I did was encrypt it, because I'm like, if somebody breaks in, they can grab that right off the desk and go. Like, there's no friction to stealing that at all. So yeah, just keeping in mind all the endpoints. And we talk about that, I think in the privacy community, we think about that a lot in terms of the far end. Like, I see a lot of people who criticize encrypted email because they're like, oh, most people don't use encrypted email. It might be encrypted while it's in your inbox, but it's still unencrypted in their inbox. And which is a valid but different argument. But the point is, like, we don't always think about it in the context of, okay, but now there's a second copy of your data on your end of things sitting on that external hard drive on the desk, or sitting on that computer synced up through Signal or whatever, that's less secure. Or, some people run a NOS and they use, what is it, like Sync Thing to sync their data. And it's like, okay, now you've got this constantly running 24/7 device sitting in the corner that's syncing all your calendar, your contacts, your data. So yeah, it's really important to, when you do that threat modeling and you start building your security posture, I guess we'll call it, it's important to have that moment where you stop and think about every step of the chain. What happens if this gets compromised, if this threat happens, break in, flood. I mean, it's really important to think about that whole picture and not just think like, okay, I'm using Signal, I'm good.
I think another thing that's also kind of important in this story is the person that had their iPhone seized. It was actually only an iPhone 13, which isn't, one of the latest generations of iPhones that has more of those hardware security features like the iPhone 17, which has MTE, memory tagging enforcement. So it's interesting that even an iPhone 13 with lockdown mode enabled was able to block these sort of forensic tools, which I think kind of shows the power of lockdown mode itself, actually, because, you would expect an older device is probably more likely to be exploited because of its age, right? Through hardware vulnerabilities and stuff like that. And because it doesn't have that updated hardware, it's kind of surprising. So that was another thing that was quite surprising to me in this story.